South African political mainstay Helen Zille has confirmed that she's finished the writing for and is set to release a book warning South Africans to be wary of the American imported woke politics being reinvigorated in our country by social media culture wars after a generation or two of incubation in our universities. Since that coincides with one of my channel's main aims, in the short to mid-term at least, my curiosity has obviously been piqued. Now, this isn't the first time that Zille has spoken out against the woke politics of the West infiltrating South African society, and I'm very interested to get a better understanding of her understanding of what's playing out and the ways in which it might impact us. In the past, she's mostly focused on the effect of woke journalism, to be expected given her journalistic background, and the enormous power she knows the press potentially represents. Okay, for any non-South African visitors that happen to have stopped by, let me give you a quick catch-up on who I'm even talking about here. So, Helen Zille has basically been a fixture of South African politics for decades. And actually, from an American perspective, she'd probably appear to have all of her woke credentials in order. She was an anti-apartheid journalist and a black sash activist in the 80s. She was a major part of uncovering the apartheid government of black consciousness leader Steve Biko. She served as the mayor of Cape Town and the leader of the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, or the DA. She was a senior policy fellow at the Institute for Race Relations, and in 2008 she was awarded the title World Mayor of the Year. Unfortunately, much like a number of old-school feminists who've been character assassinated in the States, even Helen Zille has failed to prove woke enough for modern ideas of social justice. She's made a couple of verbal missteps, and her early instinctual reactions to woke politics earned her attacks from both inside and outside of the DA. She has, in my opinion, been unfairly painted with the racist brush, and that's lost her some of the influence she once commanded. Now, when it comes to her upcoming book, I do hope that Zille cogently makes the point that extends beyond simply woke journalism, as bad as that might be. Woke activism, corrupt education, and the reshaping of culture through manipulated social media are probably far more pressing concerns than simply journalism. Because while dishonest journalism does piss me off, it is just a byproduct of a wider, more holistic cultural and political attack. In recent months, we've even seen French officials, intellectuals, and even the French president recognizing this and hitting out at the impact of America's woke politics. At the end of the day, social justice politics are a smokescreen, a distraction. I complained recently about South African activism against gender-based violence, and this wasn't because I don't think it matters if women are murdered. It's because femicide does not exist in South Africa. That's a narrative, it's a distraction, it's the smokescreen I'm talking about. What we have in South Africa is a ridiculously high murder rate across the board. And claiming that we have an epidemic of femicide and men who hate women simply paints male residents as the enemy of female residents, more and more turning one against the other. And this is what all woke politics does. It redirects legitimate frustrations against illegitimate targets. It invents enemies out of innocence, and then directs mobs to exact vengeance on those who've done nothing to earn it. The truth that woke politics obscures is the fact that the enemies of South Africa are the regimes whose policies have ensured the suffering of our people, and the corrupt entities, corporate and otherwise, that have enabled them. But the state that our government has left our nation in has left our population understandably vulnerable to being misled and volatile when it senses injustice. And since our education system is as lazy as our journalism is becoming, overeducated idiots call themselves educators, mindlessly share American learned lessons that haven't even passed the muster of rigorous academic speculation in their country of origin, and then use those lessons to confuse local conversations beyond the point of absurdity that we were already precariously teetering on. And so we end up with half-cocked, aggressively ignorant uni kids coming off assembly lines around the country, utterly convinced that they know everything and are morally unassailable, all looking for victims to pander to rather than problems to solve. That many of these activated academics then become journalists, projecting their disconnected worldview out into the country and perpetuating the problem is hard to deny. But the influence of mass centralized media is shrinking, and its current clickbait punish or perish strategy of lashing out against its own extinction only perpetuates its proliferation of fake news, thus accelerating its own irrelevance. Big media is dying. The long-term problem that social justice politics highlights is one with an ever more interconnected and centralized world, to be honest. I don't think we should go the Chinese route of banning big tech from our country. But as an example, maybe we could focus on improving data availability as a priority. And then rather than sinking R1 billion into bailing out the SABC every year, we could reinvest that money and those skills into the development and expansion of native digital infrastructure, forums, and platforms, so that maybe South Africa can find its own voice rather than always being swept up in an international chorus. Kids who set fire to universities, or just wrecked universities, in the backwards belief that they could somehow compel lower fees by raising the cost of administration. Or how about protesters who set fire to trains because those were late? Yes, it's the logic that drives actions like these that is at the heart of modern social justice. And unfortunately, that modern social justice that we're seeing coming out of America, that's been in South Africa's blood and bones since long before America reinvigorated it. You got to remember that contemporary ideas of social justice are outgrowths of communism. When people refer to cultural Marxism, they are observing that social justice applies the Marxist concepts of bourgeois oppressor and oppressed proletariat to social settings, identifying victims and victimizers in absolutely every personal, professional, or societal relationship. And then you've got to remember that South Africa served as one of the primary front lines of the Cold War. The infamous border war, for example, is considered one of the last hot conflicts of the Cold War. And even apartheid justified their oppression of the black population almost as much by a fear of communism as by racism. The abolition of apartheid and the institution of democratic South Africa was essentially a compromise whereby the communists, who represented the majority black population, took power, but the system within which they ruled was still capitalist and democratic in nature, and thus was associated with white foreigners. That's the simplified backstory to current narratives of Mandela as a race traitor, and that's why the EFF is always moaning about white monopoly capital. And for me, this is one of the biggest reasons we need to be incredibly cautious about American wokeness. We've already had our own brand of that political culture in our country for well over a decade, and if you take a moment to look around, you'll clearly see how well it's worked at growing our nation and making us more equal. So the title of Zille's book, Get Woke, Stay Broke, implies that she might try to lean on the financial insecurity of South Africans to drive her point home. Probably not the worst tack to take, since at the end of the day, social justice culture is not only divisive, it's also incredibly expensive. So I mentioned the fees must fall kids in the South African habit of setting fire to things that don't work as well as one might like. But Black Economic Empowerment, or BEE policies, are also an example of what happens when wokeness drives and maintains policy, and BEE is responsible, at least in part, for making it so that we can't even reliably turn on the lights because it absolutely smashed our energy sector. It also managed to ruin our education system, our military readiness, and it reduced public transport to a sham. It catalyzed a brain drain that continues to this day, and it made running a business more convoluted and more expensive due to all the regulations that it puts in place. And speaking of expenses to business, do you remember the H&M monkey shirt fiasco? With all the riots and looting of those stores because of a questionably racist t-shirt? Or how about the Valentine's campaign that Woolworths had to pull last year because it employed offensive gender stereotypes? Or what about Gillette's ill-advised "the best a man can be" a virtue signaling advert, the one that reportedly lost them around $5 billion? And how about last year when the whole world was watching as Black Lives Matter rioted across America, inspiring copycat action around the globe? And how closely were you watching? Did you notice how many low-income neighborhoods and black-owned businesses they smashed, looted, or burned? They managed to rack up about $1 billion in damages in poor neighborhoods. You pay attention to how much murder rates skyrocketed in the wake of their defund the police movement. Going woke has been trendy for a few years now, and it almost always ends up proving the adage true: go woke, go broke. Maybe America can afford the cost of woke politics, but let's be honest, South Africa is basically a failed state that just hasn't been nudged hard enough to completely fall over just yet. And if we don't change trajectory soon, we'll probably have completely failed in every sense of the word by about 2030. An upsurge in wokeness ideology in South Africa could feasibly destroy us. The term woke was coined by African Americans to mean being able to see past the mask, to see past what's presented to you. Very similar to red pill talk from that originated with the Matrix. You know, you take the red pill and you see the world for what it really is. Well, wokeness is supposed to be the same thing. Originally, that is what woke meant. It was to be able to see the world as it really is. Modern woke warriors in no way resemble this description. Somehow, for instance, Black Lives Matter activists fail to see that if every element of the establishment, from politicians to massive multinational corporations, are all walking in lockstep with you, you're probably not very woke and you're probably not seeing the world as it really is. And quite the opposite. In fact, you're probably being played. At the end of the day, modern wokeness is a grouping of critical theory schools of thought whose intellectual underpinnings elevate identity and personal truth over objective fact. This is why the solutions and narratives it comes up with are almost inevitably bound to fail. The problem is that the ideology has no built-in failsafe to correct course. Not only does it weaponize emotion to suppress speech, which prevents constructive and corrective feedback, but because of the way it diagnoses all problems as being narratives of oppression, it will always double down on mistakes that worsen the problem. Again, look at BEE for an example. A failed policy through and through. Very few in the know would sincerely argue with that. But was it scrapped? No, it would be damn near impossible, politically impossible, for the ANC to scrap it and admit that maybe they were wrong about the cure to inequality. Rather, they constantly doubled down, shifting, reforming, and refocusing BEE, and now we have BBBEE, broad-based black economic empowerment, to correct the problems of BEE, and it predictably hasn't yet shown any signs of doing so. That is social justice thinking, woke thinking. Because the trick of social justice is to appeal to emotional instincts of right and wrong, loudly moralizing dissent into silence. If you argue, you're a sexist, a racist, a homophobe, a xenophobe. And since mobs can easily be raised to assault, cancel, or otherwise terrorize anyone associated with those labels, you're forced to go along with the lie lest you risk your and your loved one's physical or financial security. And it's well known that going along with lies causes your balls to shrivel up and die, which just makes it easier to get you to open up wide and swallow more lies. And a population that has already been subject to decades of dishonesty may well be primed and ready to swallow the larger loads. And that then brings us around to South Africa's potential to response to and reception of Zille's book and the narrative she's actually shown the balls to address. It seems predictable that the mainstream legacy media will most likely belittle or lambast her because she's still too influential for them to be able to get away with ignoring her. And we've already seen that despite her history, shitty little shits will still try shutting her up with accusations of racism, which is of course a risk and side effect of social justice warriors. But what about grassroots, real-world South Africans? I know that there's so many problems in this country that the addition of social justice narratives from America probably doesn't seem like the biggest deal. But I've noticed more and more South African commentators popping up on international political streams, feeds and forums over the past few years, airing their concerns about the growing influence of woke sociopolitics, which is promising. But I've also had several conversations with people I would have assumed were level-headed, but who ended up sounding like they just got straight off the boat from some North American re-education camp. In general, South Africa is very conservative, and I would assume that we would gravitate towards conservative sensibilities. And the problem is, though, that the audience who most needs to understand media and political manipulation will probably never read this book. And those who are likely to read a political non-fiction, many will already know which side of the line they're on, and they won't be readily open to changing sides. And that's why it's important for those who recognize wokeness for the nonsense it is, to speak up and to inform others, to not be frightened of being called racist. Just don't be racist. Be honest and stay true. Academia has had decades to filter somewhat diseased thinking through to the masses, primarily via the humanities. And maybe this book will be a significant part of trying to play catch-up, and sparking a conversation in the local mainstream and guiding it in helpful directions. If nothing else, I hope Zille's book will energize efforts against the solidifying of American woke culture in South Africa and maybe bolster the side with a few new arguments that the rest of us haven't yet considered. Either way, that's me for now. If you like this video, you know what to do. Hit like, hit subscribe, and let's keep the conversation going. Cheers until next time.